members, welcome and good evening one and all. And what a bizarrely beautiful evening it is here in Essex. I hope some of you are enjoying a slightly sunnier evening as well, but I doubt we're quite in garden weather yet. I remember 2 years ago we were all sat doing Zooms in our garden at this time. And that is what we're going to talk about tonight, climate change. But of course, before we do crack on to the subject in hand, a few little bits of housekeeping. John said it's raining in Alva. A few little bits of housekeeping. Mahesh is behind the scenes, so hello and thank you, Mahesh. He'll be on hand to answer any questions. Please do pop those in the Q&A. I should note that a few of you have already emailed me in questions, and I've woven the answers into the presentation as best I can. So that might mean we run a little bit over our standard 45 minutes. We might be more like 50, but if we are, then that still leaves us lots of time for questions to take us up to the end of the hour. Other than questions, I can see already some of you using the chat to let us know where you are, weather, and what you're drinking. So please continue to do so. And then other than that, I will just quickly let you know which wines I'm tasting tonight and the order, and encourage you to start immediately if you wish. But this is the order I'll taste tonight. So I'm going to taste the Tablas Creek White first, then the Simpsons Pinot Noir, and then the Singapoi from Mont Ventoux. So what I would suggest is, if you are tasting along with me, please do feel free to start on that white wine. And each of these wines tonight really is going to tell a little bit of a story about climate change. Another note just before we kick off that I found just sort of pertinent. This originally was earlier, so this has been rescheduled. And since we rescheduled this, I think I was in Bordeaux 2 weeks ago, and this was supposed to be happening for an MW study trip. Since then, actually quite a bit has happened in terms of climate change, quite fortuitously, but not necessarily positively. So we had the IPCC document or report, I should say, released yesterday. I'm not going to go into too much detail on that, but to give it some wider context, the message really is we need to act now. And the evidence, unfortunately, was seen all across France this weekend, why we need to act now. Freak frosts, there have often been frosts, but I'll talk about frosts in a bit. But I was in France this weekend, and for the first time ever in April, we were up in a little mound, it's certainly not a hill, in a little wine village called Rasteau, and it was snowing. And I don't think I've ever tasted wine in their winery snowing before. So we will talk about that, but certainly thoughts go out to those across Europe who are struggling, Britain and France and parts of Germany, Austria, who are struggling with those freak frosts this week. So climate change is a challenging topic when we talk about wine. I've heard a lot of people argue that it's we're a luxury product. So as the climate changes, we're not necessarily at the top of the rung when it talks about sustainability or, agriculture. But there is a counter argument to that I believe strongly in, which is that people, not only is it a cultural thing, but also that grapes and wine production is many people's livelihoods, hundreds of thousands of people around the world. So just the change in the climates is going to affect their livelihoods, and that's not something to be sniffed at. So I'm glad we're covering this topic. We're going to discuss problems, but we are going to put a big focus on solutions as well, because we could be here for hours, days, weeks. There are podcasts, books, everything made about this subject. So I'm going to cherry pick some areas. So we're going to cover broadly water and kind of water management with the first wine, temperature increase, like general air temperature increase, and then erratic weather events. And then, to be honest, the last wine's just going to finish off with some nice stories about things that are happening in parts of the world that are intelligent, should we say, choices around climate change. So first things first, grapes are sensitive. They are incredibly sensitive to temperature. Yes, they're very good at things like dry conditions that we're going to talk about in a minute, but they are incredibly sensitive to climate change. I'll touch on it really quickly, but Fascinating climate historians have basically shown that there are peaks and troughs, as I'm sure you know, in climate patterns, but that where we should be right now is not on the increase. And that's going to cause us some problems. And that's just what we call global warming. But we're going to cover climate change, defining climate as the macro. Weather is the small thing we're experiencing. So changes in weather are something we can, as humans, can comprehend far more easily. But the change in our climate is what we're really talking about when we talk more broadly. So first thing I'm going to talk about, I already mentioned it, is water. Sea levels are rising. I'm not going to show you a sea level map. I could have done, but they're a bit controversial. But sea levels are rising. Vines in parts of Portugal, California, New Zealand, they could be underwater by 2100. I don't really know how to say that. Does anyone? 2100? Seems weird. But we're going to talk about the first wine, which is an amazing example of how you can combat drought. Now, this is a wine from California. I'm just going to pop it up now. Tablas Creek. Tablas Creek, Patillon de Tablas, they're blanc, they're white wine. We also sell their red. Now, I've just flashed it up. Do feel free to taste, but I'll just talk to you a quick little moment about what we're talking about when we're expressing drought or drought problems with regards to wine. So without water, a vine cannot photosynthesize. It simply cannot produce grapes. So there are areas in the world that have experienced these sorts of droughts, and has completely affected the yield, as in the production. Many of you may remember Day Zero in South Africa a few years ago. I happened to be in Cape Town, not far off when Day Zero was projected. And that was literally the moment where the reservoir water was going to stop. There had not been enough rain. 5 years the drought lasted. And I drove over I won't dwell on this too much, but I drove over a pass where you should have been able to see water at the car level. We got out of the car and the water level was below the pipe. And this was the largest reservoir going over from Franschhoek to Stellenbosch that some members may have driven before. The water level was below the pipe where the water is released or drained out, I suppose. So South Africa, horrific droughts. California has experienced them. And there is a really intelligent way to combat this, and this is why I wanted to talk about this wine. Tablas Creek is it's a second generation Jason Haas. So his family started it. His father started it with the Perrin family from the Rhone fame. So you may know Chateau de Beaucastel, very famous Chateauneuf de Pape wine. And they decided they wanted to bring in Rhone grape varieties to California. Now, the Rhone is actually also very dry, specifically the southern Rhone. So they already knew that the grape varieties were pretty good. And there are good grape varieties at handling drought in here. But the other thing is they knew that they wanted to dry farm. And dry farming is regulated pretty extensively in Europe. So very little dry farming allowed, usually just when you introduce the vines. But in the rest of the world, irrigation is quite common. But Tablas Creek decided they wanted to dry farm. But why did they do that? Well, the roots dig deeper. Now, if you imagine, if you have not dry farmed, if you've irrigated vines all their life and they're used to catching water on the top of the soil, then unfortunately, when there is no water, they're not going to have the root system to dig down. There's a few ways they've done this. So they were certified organic, then they went to biodynamics, and I visited them when they were at biodynamic level, and they've since gone on to be regenerative organic. And they do all sorts of things. One thing that they do incredibly well is they sequester carbon. So they keep carbon in the soils by not much tilling, or I'm going to show you another way they keep carbon in the soils. Sheep and llamas. This is really important. They grow cover crops in between the vines. That keeps the carbon levels good. And then they can mulch that, and the animals are also providing natural fertilizer. All these sorts of things actually keep carbon in the soil. So yes, okay, that's great for the environment. They're not releasing it. But not only that, the more carbon and organic matter is in your soil, the better you are at managing the water of the soils. So they can dry farm in this way, i.e. they don't irrigate. Now, ironically, I think this is probably one of the only irrigation pictures here. But by and large, I think it's 70% that they dry farm, and they're slowly moving into full dry farming, which in this part of the world is incredible. It gets hotty in Paso Robles, let me tell you. How else do they dry farm? Well, there's a few other cool things that they do. So I've told you about the sheep, I've told you about the biodynamics and regenerative organics. They make biochar from their vine materials. So that's very cool. They basically burn the dead vines that they've pruned, and they make biochar. And then what I found really interesting, you don't hear about this very much, is they keyline plow. So they create furrows that go across and not down. So when the water does come, it stops and it settles rather than just flowing down these sort of, because a lot of vineyards like to be planted downward on a slope. There was a drought here in Tablas Creek from 2012 to 2016, and the dry farmed blocks thrived. They averaged just 15 inches of rain per year, and their dry blocks outperformed the irrigated blocks. And Jason has an amazing Porto Protocol, which is a very good webinar series and initiative run by Taylor's owner, Adrian Bridge. And he says that essentially in this incredibly dry Mediterranean climate, you can dry farm. So you just need to have minimal or no irrigation, space your vines enough, and have the right kind of soil, but it can be done. You do not need to rely on water in order to get your vine, you do not need to rely on man-made, not man-made water, but man-injected water or man-dripped water, man-irrigated water in order to grow really, really good grapes. So let's have a taste of it if you haven't already, shame on you if you haven't, because it's such a good wine. This is 35% Grenache Blanc, and then I think the next portion is 25 Roussanne. Yeah, 25 Roussanne, 19 Viognier, 14 Marsanne, and then 7 Clairette Blanc. It is whole cluster pressed, so they put the whole thing in there, and it's in stainless steel. So we're not using oak here, but we are using native yeasts, and it preserves the freshness and the aromatics. So let's have a taste. I had a creamy salmon dish I have to eat before the 7 o'clock events, because my tummy starts to rumble about 7:45. And I had a salmon with a sort of creamy garlic boursin sauce. And I have to say, I wish I'd saved some for this combo, because it's sort of rich. It's got white pepper, it's got white pear, it's got peaches, apricots. I love Rhone blends for that reason. You get loads and loads of bang for your buck. Have a taste, and then we're going to move on to some other problems. So you might want to enjoy a glass of this whilst we talk some more problems. It's got a lovely rich mouthfeel that I love. That'll be coming from a few of those grapes: Grenache, Roussanne, Viognier, Marsanne. Other than Clairette, they're all quite chunky grapes, and that 7% Clairette is that acidic lift that you feel. Clairette is amazing at kind of giving the va-va-voom to the heftier grapes of the Rhone. I will be honest with you, and Jason is honest about this, he does acidify his wine. So he does add acid, and that's because of the temperature is so extreme that when the grapes reach their ripeness, the phenolic ripeness, the acidity has already started to drop off. Right. John's just mentioned about in Santorini they grow a Certico that receives basically no rain from the morning dew. Exactly. There are ways that you can thrive. They also grow their grapes low to the ground so that it can absorb more of that ground moisture, atmospheric ground moisture. So they actually completely, along with the wind, and that's one of the reasons they grow their grapes so low to the ground. So other reasons as well. But people have to adapt. So let's talk about grape growing whilst we're on the subject. You may have heard that vines need to be grown at 30 to 50 degrees latitude. Now, the other thing that vines need are certain temperatures. So we're going to talk now more broadly about the slow and steady increase of temperature on the planet. Not the freak heat waves, we'll talk about those in a minute, but the slow and steady temperature increase. Sorry, it has shown up. I converted these to Celsius earlier because this is a very famous maturity table that shows you what temperature on average certain grape varieties need within the growing season. Under there is Müller Thurgau and Pinot Blanc. So hiding underneath my 13 to 50. But what you can see is that there are lots of white grapes and Pinot Noir that tend to prefer these cooler climates. Cabernet Franc as well thrown in there. And then there are grapes that prefer the heat. And we'll talk about those in a moment. But this is the average temperature that these vines thrive in. Yes, there are marginal bits where you can grow something, on the coolest end. We're going to have some Pinot Noir in a moment grown on that cooler end. But at a point, grapes stop becoming either productive or even taste very nice. So we can't, for example, I'll just throw out an example here. Merlot is not going to like the temperature increase as much as Cabernet Sauvignon is. And when I say it's a bad choice of word, but Merlot needs slightly cooler. And interestingly, the production of Merlot is going up in Bordeaux and not down. And actually, Cabernet Sauvignon would be the better grape variety. But what's not on here, and I'll mention them quickly now, are some new grapes that have been introduced to Bordeaux that sit more at this hotter end. And those are less common grapes, but they're ones found in Portugal, like Tourigo Nacional. And the reason those have been introduced, they're currently allowed at 10% maximum of the blend, only in AOC Bordeaux and Bordeaux Superior. But the reason they've introduced those is that they are expecting that slowly the lovely Cabernet Franc that we love and Merlot from the right bank are not necessarily going to be suitable. So there are already places, mad that Bordeaux was one of the first, but there are already places that are introducing new grape varieties. It's worth saying, I'll mention a couple more grapes before we move on from this slide. But essentially, these are just examples I'm throwing out, but it's much harder for European AOCs to change the rules. There are a lot less rules in New World. So, for example, in Australia, you might start to see, and we've got some at the moment, we've got an Australian Nebbiolo. We've got loads of Australian white varieties coming through. So Fiano, Greco di Tufo. These grapes are white varieties that don't live in this cooler area. They can be grown in warmer climates, or indigenous Italian grape varieties from the south of Italy often. So southern Italian varieties in Australia. Larkmead is a company in California who are doing an experimental plantation. I've listened to an amazing podcast with the guy whose name escapes me. He basically said that they've fallen on their own sword. In California, you want to go grow Cabernet Sauvignon if you want to make money, but it's just not going to be viable forever. And so they're kind of having to sacrifice plots in order to plan for 50 years' time. So Tourigo Nacional is one of the grapes that he's experimenting with as well. A lot of people think because it's such a good quality Douro grape that makes incredible wines in the Douro, that might be a solution. So I'll just quickly tell you about grape growing quickly before we move on to England. Harvests are now about 13 days earlier than they have ever been in Europe in particular. So there's loads of data about harvest days, and there's all sorts of those crazy scientists that can do the geology weather that blows my mind. So since 1988, harvest is about 13 days earlier. Now, for anybody who's sort of a climate change denier, yes, there have been temperature ebbs and flows. So in Roman times, the temperature was actually so much warmer in the UK, not warmer than it is now, but so much warmer than our recent history, that you could actually grow decent quality grapes in Roman times. But after that, we had something called the Saxon slump, and they couldn't. But that ebb and flow of that 30 to 50 degrees latitude, where you're kind of saying acceptable areas to grow grapes, acceptable areas to grow grapes, that has always happened. And those territories of viticulture do ebb and flow. But what is not normal is that we should not be increasing at the rate we're seeing. And the speed at which it's happening is not just the natural, almost breath of the earth. This is something different. So yes, for anyone saying, but how didn't they grow grapes in Roman times? And, you know, if you go back to the 1500s, I think there's evidence in Burgundy from the 1300s onwards of harvest dates. Yes, there is evidence of earlier harvest dates, but we're talking about trends, and the trend is wrong. However, it is good news for some people, and unfortunately or fortunately, whichever way you want to look at it, Brits are on the up. I believe that one of my MW fellow students, Janice, is watching this evening, and Janice lives in Denmark. She assures me that although they are growing wine in Denmark, it is not very good. Having not tried it myself, I'm going to take her word for it. But Norway, Sweden, Denmark all have commercial viticulture now. If you imagine that level of acceptable area is rising. And this rise, or this growth north, should we say, and south when you go to the other side of the equator, particularly things like Patagonia, which is crazy. But in 2000, I can't say it. I guess say, no, 2100, who knows? My grandchildren genuinely could be drinking Bordeaux blends from Britain. You know, it's feasible. They probably would be the Merlot Cab Franc rather than the Cabernet Sauvignon, but my grandchildren could easily be drinking those Bordeaux blends. So I've just got one more quick slide. We mentioned Bordeaux earlier, so I will just show you the trend from the 60s. This is just a lovely, easy to follow graph from Jane Anson, a professor called Gregory Gambetta, produced this for her quite recently, just last November. There's a brilliant article on her website that I will send round afterwards about climate change in Bordeaux, but this does just give you an example of the temperature increase. This is this average growing season temperature that I showed you in the previous slide. I knew there'd be a couple of geeky bits tonight. We like geeking out on the Focus On sessions. We like tasting the wine too, though, right? So without further ado, let's talk about, Simpsons, and let's talk about British wine and why on earth we can now grow Pinot Noir in England. So until the I'll show you, I'll leave this up for a second and then I'll pop it down again. But until the 1980s, Great Britain basically grew Germanic varieties and hybrids. So you may have heard of a grape variety called Bacchus. Bacchus was very popular, still is very popular. But it wasn't until around the 80s that Chardonnay started to be introduced alongside things like Pinot Noir. And hopefully you've seen the stats for that. I'll bring it up in a sec again when we taste it. But in the 80s, Chardonnays, particularly still Chardonnays, were pretty undrinkable, but now it is the most planted grape variety. In the last 10 to 15 years, it certainly had the biggest boom. As I mentioned, it did exist before then, but about 10 to 15 years. 2018 was seen by a lot of people as the industry turning point. I don't know whether anyone remembers that incredibly warm summer. And finally, it felt like the Pinot Noirs that were produced in 2018 were of the quality that people had been hoping for. There will still be a lot of challenges. So one major challenge, and I'll show you this quick map. I hope I included it. I was staring at it for ages. Yes. And I stole this from an Imperial College London report, and I hope they won't mind. It's Beth and May Rayner's produced an incredible presentation, but I've stolen the map. This shows you where the wineries in England currently are. Now you can see the large areas are certainly down in this southeast. What's really interesting is, although everyone just talks about the south of England being good for grape growing, there are studies to show that on the west coast, with climate change, but extreme weather that we're about to talk about, that the west coast actually might become too wet and it would be destructive to produce grapes here. So you can start to see the blue and the red and the orange, the light blue, I should say, is starting to move around this area. And what I would say, I know I'm dialing in from Essex and I have a bias, is that Essex is kind of at the forefront of Pinot Noir growth. For the lack of rain, it's very dry, which is important. Pinot Noir doesn't really like the rain, but also those warm climates. So it seems, and the predictions are, that by about 2040, we will have world-class Pinot Noir. So let's taste one. Now, the funny thing about Simpsons is they said in 2014, they were quoted as saying it's a Scottish, I never get this right way around, Scotsman and an Irish woman. I think it's that way around. They said they would never make still wine in 2014. And in 2016, they launched this wine after basically having experienced lots of Pinot Noirs around the world, and then tasting the English one side by side. And this is a lovely story of somebody sort of in a tent somewhere at a tasting, bringing out a bottle that they'd made, one of their neighbours. And they said they absolutely don't regret it. 2020 was a good vintage for Pinot Noir. Again, you might remember that really warm, long first lockdown summer. So it was a good year for Pinot. And the vines are 8 miles from the coast, but they're the south coast, not the west coast. So they face down, they get more sun, and then the nature of the slopes means that the frost doesn't settle. We're going to talk about frost in a second, but it's important to have that slope side, so the frost air moves down, or the cold air, I should say, away from the grapes, but you've also got the sea 8 miles away regulating the temperature a bit more. This is a 115 Burgundy clone for you clone geeks. It is a clone designed more for red wine than champagne, so that's kind of a big deal. This is not just an off-cut that didn't go into a sparkling wine, which a lot of Pinot Noirs from the UK are. This is a considered still red wine Pinot Noir. Hand-picked and then de-stemmed. It was then 3 months in French oak barrels, so it does have a little bit of oak aging, after which it was lightly filtered. I've got to be honest, I think Matthew has absolutely nailed the tasting note on here. It has got cranberry, it's got strawberry. I'm just going to copy it because I think it's great. It's got cranberry, it's got strawberry, and most importantly to me, it has that really seductive smoky thing. I don't know if I think it's smoke, so smoky spice, yes, and also smoked herbs. If you've ever put herbs on the barbecue, you know, in with your meat, and you get that kind of charred herb. I think that's really what I'm getting here. So have a taste if you've got some in the glass. Oh yeah, lovely, refreshing, high acidity. We'd be expecting that in the UK. I think, yeah, oh, it's fresh, it's crisp, it's delicious. It's got a bit of tannic structure. It's got those kind of dry and crunchy tannins, but so light and refreshing. Yeah, gorgeous. Before we move on, I've had a couple of questions in the chat about, oh, there we go. Someone's answered one of them. Thank you. John had asked me which two vineyards are the ones in Scotland. And somebody has kindly popped it in the chat. If you're not watching the chat this evening, I'll resend that if that's all right, Elizabeth Wild. Thank you for sharing. And then Nick has also said, I'm interested in where you think this country might go in terms of potential new grape varieties. And somebody else has asked about Riesling in this country. So I'll just quickly cover those off. There are so many experiments going on in the UK. I keep hearing really good things about Albarino, the Spanish grape variety, well, Spanish and Portuguese grape variety that's on the West Coast. Now that's quite interesting because of our West Coast issues. So Albarino might be a good shout. It also makes, as you know, a nice light alcohol. So as long as we can reach the right ripeness, that's interesting. There's Pinot Gris, there's Riesling. A lot of Alsatian varieties are making their way to the UK, or have already. Absolutely. Red wine is more challenging. We really are at the moment in terms of internationally well-known varieties, only focusing on Pinot Noir. However, Pinot Meunier, the other champagne grape, a lot of people have been making a still red wine out of that, which is good. Now I'm talking the sort of 5-10 year predictions of things that are currently coming onto the market. From what you saw earlier, we could be in 100 years expecting a completely different grape scene. As I mentioned, British Bordeaux blends are not off the cards, likely not to be Cabernet Sauvignon, but hey, it could easily have a Merlot Cab Franc blend for all we know. But for now, yeah, you're going to be expecting some of those more lighter varieties. I would suggest that whites will continue to be better. There's just more to be had in the white scene. So yeah, there's plenty coming. And the good thing is, and the really fun thing, you can explore different local wineries, and I guarantee that you just ask them, what are you experimenting with? There will be something. And the other thing that's maybe not quite as relevant and we can't go into today is something called peewees, which are they're sort of hybrid type things, and peewee grapes are potentially going to be quite interesting for the UK, because one thing that we've not discussed, and again, don't necessarily have time to, but the climate change doesn't just change where grapes can grow, it changes where pests and diseases can exist. So if we don't have cold winters, then some diseases and pests, well, pests in particular, but some microbial diseases won't die. So we might have some very, very significant pest and disease problems in the future. We'll have new hospitable environments for them to live in. So we might need to rely on varieties like peewee varieties, where they have been engineered to withstand some of those diseases. And that's really potentially something in the future. So without further ado, we're just I'm not gonna talk about all of these actually, because we'd be here all evening, to be honest with you. I'm going to talk about the top 3, because I think those are the ones where I can give you the best examples of what people are doing for solutions, or not, as the case may be, where it's a major problem and there isn't a solution. But I'm going to call these weather irregularities. You can call it freak weather, you can call it extreme weather patterns. We've talked broadly about climate, and we've talked about trends. And then the micro of getting into the trends is that actually within that sort of, you know, curve, within that broader trend, there are significant fluctuations. Now, there are studies that show that potentially why has it escaped me? The weather front that comes basically across the UK, that is already currently quite wavy, is going to get wavier. So pulling in different cold and hot pressures across the ocean to us. Essentially, there are all sorts of things, but what we are going to see, and this is really, we're already seeing it, is erratic and hard to predict weather patterns. So I'm going to start with heat waves. These are sunburnt grapes, which is quite terrifying. But heat waves are a thing now. They always have been a thing, but we are experiencing them more frequently. And they're also really, really hard to predict, funnily enough. The summer of jet stream. Yes, sorry, somebody's put jet stream. Thank you, Nick. I've lost for words. Yes, the jet stream is potentially going to become wavier. And that causes all sorts of problems that we're still not really sure about. So yes, potential challenges there. But Australia is a place where we have significant problems with heat waves. The summer in 2019 was the hottest temperature ever recorded in South Australia since records began. So that was in 2019. There's always been this sort of adage that you can say to a winemaker, how is this vintage? And historically they would always say, oh, great vintage, classic vintage, la la la. It's getting harder to argue that in a lot of parts of the world. There are vintages where vines are decimated, and there are vintages where winemakers and wineries lose their entire crop in worst case scenarios. So anyway, flow changes are easier to see, and you can do things. So an example with the general heat rising I was talking about earlier is you might move the canopy to try and shade it. What historically used to happen is we used to pick the canopy. We used to think that we needed more sunlight, so a lot of traditional winemakers would leave open a section of the canopy, i.e. the leaves, so that the grapes could get the sunshine. What you're finding now is, because winemakers and well, I should say vignerons are so nervous about heat burn and sunburn, they're actually a lot more shaded canopies now. And so canopy management is something that's trying to combat this, but it is harder. And of course it's going to give vintage variation. This quicker ripening, obviously sunburn is at the extreme, but quick ripening in a short space of time can mean a really disproportionately high level of sugar. Your acid can drop off a cliff. You can find that your anthocyanins and your tannins and your skins don't develop properly. So yeah, I don't know, it's sunburn will ruin a crop completely, and just general heat waves can go as far as to ruin the wine. So the best thing that can happen is that sometimes the vines can shut down, and actually that can be a bonus. Funnily enough, somebody's just mentioned 2019 was the earliest harvest in Beaujolais since the 1500s. think, Nick, as well, that was the year because everybody got really worried about I think it was either 2018 or 2019. If anyone knows, correct me if I'm wrong. A lot of the Burgundian vines did actually shut down in that year. It was so hot, and 2019 was ridiculously hot in France. That's when it beat all the temperature. All the I was in the Rhone at the time when it hit 44 degrees. It was very, very hot, but at that temperature the vines shut down, and actually in a way that is something that's actually better, because when the vines just go, no, I can't function, I can't photosynthesize, they're not putting any energy into the grapes, and you don't get that overdevelopment. So it's a bit of a catch-22. The other thing is fires. So I'll throw some stats out. This is actually a fire in Greece. This is obviously the actual vineyards catching fire. This is, bear with me, I thought I had another photo, let me just check. Oh yeah, okay. So fires, first of all, you can actually lose your crop to fire, so you can actually have your vineyards burn. That's a black and white problem. In 2020, 2.2 million acres of vineyards and forest and wild bush burnt in California. So that gives 2.2 million acres. And these fires are driven by a number of factors. So the high temperatures are one of them. There are generally lower humidities, so that doesn't help, not having the moisture in the air. It can be human encroachment into the wildlife. So it can be things like electricity pylons failing. It could be things like people having an illegal camping fire. And then there are accumulated fuels in the forests. You know, forestry management maybe hasn't been our strongest point. And again, I was chatting to another fellow MW student about this just a couple of weeks ago. And California's managed their forestry management is done by the state, and there isn't always the best connect between what needs to go and what doesn't. And I think we're still learning when it comes to that. To give you a few stats just to geek out on quickly, these are for California. Sorry, I just had to double check there, going mad. These are stats for California, and these are satellite data for, this is when they measure fire radiative power from satellites, and this just gives you an idea about what happened in 2020 here. Pretty scary stuff. Likewise, this is of Australia, and these were the fires I mentioned at the beginning of this. So these were the burn zones, i.e. where things were actually burnt and destroyed. And then beyond those burn zones, what we do get, and Australia suffers with this so badly, but they are the world leading experts, is we get smoke taint. Now, smoke taint is terrifying because you don't necessarily know that your grapes have been affected until you bring them in or you can test them. And those fires in 2020 in Australia had 3 times as much smoke taint damage as they did fire damage. So if you imagine that was just the fire area that burnt on that last slide, times that by 3, and then that's how much smoke taint affect, how the quantity or certainly the volume visually of smoke affected grapes during that fire. So what can you do about smoke taint? What can you do about fires? Well, lots of research being done on smoke taint. Can it physically be removed from wines or from the must, from the grape juice? Some people think it might potentially be in the future, but you're going to have to filter it quite hard. And when you put it through those small filters, you are going to potentially extract some other flavors. And then naturally we can try and prevent these fires. So the local policies is really important. Replanting schemes, but replanting with certain species. Unfortunately, I've heard that basically vines often act as a fire break. Depending on the density of the vines and whether they've been irrigated, etc., they often actually act as a fire break. So the fire basically rushes and rushes and rushes until it hits the vines, and then there's not much you can do about it. So it's looking after the management around the vineyard that's becoming so much more important. Managing your private and your and helping with the public management of forestry. So that's a tough one. And many of you will know Lismore Wine Estates and Samantha O'Keefe, who sadly got her entire winery burnt down a few years ago, and she's finally back up and running, but yeah, her entire winery burnt down in South Africa. last quick problem, and then we'll taste the final wine, because the final wine's positive. There's lots of nice things to talk about, but it's the one that's on everyone's lips at the moment. It's frost. Now, frost is not necessarily the problem. So we'll have frost. Frost has always existed. Frost has always happened. Frost will continue to happen. And our marginal regions, so we're talking things like Chablis, Champagne here in the UK, yes, we have frosts later into the season. These late frosts are bad, but it's not just the frosts that makes the sort of perfect storm, if you excuse the pun, of why this is bad. We have just experienced what I'm about to describe, which is we tend to have erratic weather patterns that mean we have a mild spell followed by a frost. So I was in Austria during what I can only describe as the March heat wave that some of you may have experienced. I was getting lots and lots of pictures of the warmest days of the year whilst I was cold in Austria, but at the MW seminar, a week and a bit ago. However, some of you in the UK may have experienced some lovely sunny climes. Now, what that does is that makes the vine think, oh, it's springtime, I'll start to get growing. And what happens is, this was experienced over northern France in particular, less so in the southern Rhone. They weren't quite there yet, but certainly in northern France, Bordeaux has also already said that it was happening. You get bud bursts. So the buds are finally coming out. They are getting themselves ready to produce the flowers and then therefore the grapes. If you've got a frost that occurs after that bud burst, you're damaging an exposed part of the vine. If you think of that hardwood of the vine, when it gets frosty, it gets frosty all winter, it's okay. Obviously, long periods under certain temperatures are not good, but it can survive. What can't survive are those buds. They're too infantile, they're too young. So essentially, if that gets frosted, and that is the right term, it always sounded stupid to me, but if it gets frosted, then the vine might lose that part of the yield. So depending on how bad it is, it could lose all of its yield. For example, the whole of France last year lost 30% of its crop. So that's an average of the whole of France. That's around 2 billion euros worth of wine was lost to that very, very late frost last year. I think it was the 4th of May. It was crazy late. And it wasn't a horrific frost, but it was cold enough to damage those buds that had come out in April. So that's the problem. It's not just the frost by itself. Frost happens in December, no biggie. It's the delayed frosts that we're experiencing with those sort of peak warm days earlier in the year. So Mahesh has just said in the chat that Joe Locke, Joe Locke MW buyer for Alsace and the Loire, has just got back from the Loire, and she said that some vineyards have been affected by frost. So yeah, it's certainly quite obviously happening in the northern part of France. And fingers crossed, I didn't hear of anyone in the Rhone when I was there at the weekend, but we had another frost day since. So what can you do? There's two big examples I'm going to give you. One is the expensive option, that is that you deal with the problem when it happens. And sometimes with frost, that is your only solution. There are two types of frost. One is a black frost, one is a white frost. Won't go into it, but sometimes the only thing is that frost hits and it comes quick and you don't even know it's coming. And in that case, you have to act quickly overnight. So it'll be things like bougies, those candles that you've probably seen in the press over the last couple of days. Frost fans, if you see big sort of god-awful ugly but very handy fans, that's to move the air around. Helicopters, even used in some wealthier sort of domains, or particularly in New Zealand, it's quite a bit more common than it is in Europe. Again, the rotator moves all the air around. So what you're doing there is you're stopping the frost from settling. But what can we do in the future to prevent frost being a problem? Because we can't keep, I remember one English winery I went to, and it escapes me, Black Chalk. They told me the price for, it was the area that they'd, it was something like £30,000 a hectare in order to turn the cannons on, move the air around. And some days they just had to say, right, if it's 1 day of frost, we can do it. If it's 2 days, we can't sell the wine for that price. So, the reactive answer is not going to be a long-term solution. So what is a proactive thing we can do? We can prune later. Now that sounds a bit crazy, but the later we prune, you can actually delay those buds bursting. So with human logistics, and I'll mention it in a minute, it's not always possible, but it's certainly something that a lot more people are doing. And you're seeing vines, you know, spend later and later and later. And even now, people with some vines were only being pruned in the end of March, where we've just been in Bordeaux, Austria, and in the Rhone. So people are leaving it later, and that's down to frost. So let's have a quick chat about our last wine, and then I'm going to tell you some really nice things that they're doing and a kind of alternative future. It's not all doom and gloom. We've talked about problems and solutions, and we've also talked, I think, about opportunities in the UK with our Pinot Noir. This is what I like to think of as an alternative future. So how do we continue to drink the wine styles that we love? We have to make some changes. So I've taken a wine from the Southern Rhone. It uses grape varieties that go into Châteauneuf-du-Pape. It is also only 30 minutes away from Châteauneuf-du-Pape. And yes, the soils are not exactly the same. It's slightly different formation. But instead of the hot, flat plains of Châteauneuf-du-Pape, where we're already seeing sort of people struggling with alcohol levels, and good producers are coping, bad producers are basically making something that's starting to taste like port. But the good ones are coping. But in the next 50 years, are we going to keep being able to do this? So how do we get the grapes of Châteauneuf-du-Pape in a way that is not an 18% alcohol drink, or, you know, crazy low acidity? So this particular wine is from the appellation of Ventoux, and I'm just going to quickly show you a photo. The Mont Ventoux up here, don't be fooled, that's actually not snow, it's limestone. But there was when I was there this week, there was snow all over Mont Ventoux, so it does get cold. The vines are not actually grown on, these are the flat Southern Rhone, the classic Appalachian plains that you would see. So this, although actually I'm not sure, this isn't Châteauneuf-du-Pape, I'm trying to work out which angle it's from. It's probably a Côte de Rhone vineyard. But anyway, the Ventoux vines themselves are actually more around these slopes down here. So it's on the bottom bit. The mountain's about 2,000 meters. The hillside vines are only about 300. But what they get is they get a cooling influence coming down off the mountain. The mountain air acts a little bit like air conditioner. Do I mean air conditioning? Yeah, air conditioning. So it cools them down, and that delays the harvest. It also allows good acidity. So the slow and steady development of flavors, you retain the acidity because it's also a bit colder at night, which helps acidity retention. And it really, really delays that harvest date. So in the 80s, Châteauneuf-du-Pape would be harvested between the 5th and 10th of September. And Ventoux was more like the 25th. So it was almost exactly 2 weeks later than the final day of Châteauneuf-du-Pape. Now, Châteauneuf-du-Pape is no longer even harvested in September. It's come up to mid to late August. And the Ventoux is harvesting around the 10th of September, which is actually where Châteauneuf-du-Pape was 40 years ago. So you can see that the timing has stayed the same. There's a 2-week delay between Châteauneuf and Ventoux, but it's shifted. That 2 weeks has moved. And that extended growing season, you may remember from my original slides, really early on with the grape varieties, those growing days, that average temperature throughout the growing season, it suits, you know, certain grapes suit certain things. Grenache is brilliant, and Mourvèdre is brilliant at keeping a cool head in a hot climate. Syrah less so. So you might start to find that the Syrah is decreasing in your Rhone blends, and the Mourvèdre or the Carignan is increasing, or they have to move into the hillsides. It's not all rosy, I should say. That cooler location does mean you get nastier frosts, but again, if you're going to be able to manage the frosts, then great. Let's quickly talk about Singapoi, and then I'm going to quickly run through a couple of initiatives that the Ventoux does on a positive note, because they've got some really amazing things going on. So Singapoi is a tiny estate. It's actually owned by Keira Knightley and her husband John Wrighton, and I'm sure James Wrighton. I'm sure Kira and James would be fantastic winemakers if they were, to put their hand to it, but they don't make the wine. They own the vineyards. And the wine is made by a very good winemaker. And it's next door to the more famous Chateau Valcoux. It's also named after the 5 springs which are in the vineyard. So great for when they need that water and when drought can be a problem. Like Châteauneuf-du-Pape, it is Grenache dominated, and it's sort of a hint of oak. It's not a very oaky wine. It's still fresh. I think there's a lot of black fruits in here. So I still think the Syrah is singing, which a lot of Châteauneuf-du-Pape now is red fruit dominated. It's very Grenache. So even though stylistically, technically Grenache dominated, I think stylistically it has got that lovely Syrah. It's got a bit of peppery stuff on the nose. So have a taste. So for me, this has kind of the joy of the fruit from the Rhone. It's got quite decent tannins, so it needs food. It's got black and red fruits for sure. I'm getting something else that I can't put my finger on. It's definitely got blue fruits too. It might come to me as I sort of think and talk. It has got, I tell you what, it has got that lovely Garrique that I get from some Southern Rhone wines. Garrique is the local herb, and it's kind of like lavender infused with thyme. It feels a little bit like that to me, more on the thymy side. It doesn't taste too much of lavender, but yeah, it's got that lovely aroma to it. Delicious. Just on a positive note, whilst I look at the questions as they've come in, some of the initiatives that basically Ventoux is dominated by cooperatives, and because of that, historically quality hasn't always been brilliant, even though the location is fantastic. But I've forgotten his name. The new president of the AOC has basically absolutely reinvented the management of the AOC, so the Appellation Ventoux in general. So what you'll often find is people like Jason Haas have really amazing initiatives, and he's helping globally to make other wineries regenerative organic. For example, what the guy did in Ventoux is he said, right, I'm going to do a survey. I'm going to ask people what they want, the producers, the growers. And he comes from an independent winery, and he said, let's do things together. So one of the main objectives that they all decided as a group was to reduce the carbon footprint of the region, Ventoux, by 30%. So how have they done that? They've got a huge reforestation project, a huge cover crop project, and then my absolute favorite, which is the one I'll finish on because I just think it's such a genius idea. Instead of throwing your bottles away, because so many people drink locally or tourists will drink locally or whatever, if you've bought your bottles at the cellar door, they will collect your old bottles, take them to a place in Avignon. So it doesn't matter which bottles are which. They get washed, they get refilled, and then they get handed back to the wineries. So they're reusing glass. So yeah, I mean, it's incredible, actually. So hats off to them. So we've got 7 minutes for questions. I have had some through from the chat that Mahesh has kindly put into my chat with him, because otherwise I can't see them. So next time, if you do have a question, please pop them in the Q&A. Otherwise I can't see them. Otherwise I scroll through and then I get distracted by all your comments on wines and whatnot. So we have had a question on smoke taint. It looks like Mahesh has answered it, but just if you're not following the chat, smoke taint is not just sat on the berry, and in fact it's not that, because you could wash your grapes before you press them and you still have a problem with smoke taint. It sort of combines with all sorts of things inside the grape, and they believe that it's actually in the not epidermal. It's the layer underneath the skin that's kind of absorbing it all. There's an amazing layer where all the goodies sit, and that's potentially where some smoke taint is sitting. The Australian Wine Research Institute has so much information on this that I will try and, if I remember, link to. But essentially what happens is sometimes you press the wine and you don't even know it's got smoke taint. Sometimes you can produce your wine that's absolutely fine, and then 2 years later it falls off a cliff. So that's why so much research is being done in the moment. It's a new territory, and we have worked with producers, unfortunately, whose wines have not aged well, and we've had to address it with them. I won't name names because it's not their fault, but there are producers all around the world who have said maybe smoke tape, maybe not, we don't know, and we've kind of taken a punt on it and then had to say, unfortunately, we can't sell these wines. And it does different things to different grape varieties as well, so there's no hard and fast answer. There aren't really the tests that we need, so it's really challenging. Oh, sorry, it's Janice that answered it anyway. I expect that might be Janice from my MW study group, so thank you, Janice. But yeah, she's posted a good answer on the chat. So let's have a quick look. So Peter Cousins has asked, some parts of the world, particularly in the New World, Chile and Argentina, etc., have the option of moving higher up into the mountains. Other wine regions don't have that option. Do you think that the areas with that flexibility will come to dominate? What an amazing question, Peter. I think that they will certainly have more options. If you imagine it like a painter and the colors of that's very poetic and I'm not trying to be, but if you imagine them like an artist or a painter and you're trying to have as many colors in your palette or tools in your kit as possible, those producers who can grow at different altitudes and grow at different slopes will undoubtedly have more options. What will generally tend to happen is limitations will occur. And the other thing, I mentioned it briefly earlier, but Chile and Argentina in particular don't have the same AOC regulations. So to put it in perspective, if you were a producer of Syrah in Crozes-Hermitage, so you make it wine in the Northern Rhone, you are only allowed to produce Syrah. Once Syrah starts to become a bit problematic, you have a major problem. The Syrah grown in somewhere like Chile, for example, you could, okay, they're not doing it now, but in 50 years, you could be planting Syrah in Patagonia, because Syrah doesn't actually really like that heat. So there aren't rules in the New World in the same way that there are in the AOCs of the old, we don't use those terms anymore, but European AOCs in particular. So it's really important to note that as a major difference. It's not just the flexibility from what you've got to play with in terms of geology or geography or slopes or altitude aspect, whatever it might be. The other thing will actually be grape varieties, and I think that's an area that the world can change. You know, we can't make more mountains, but we can change which grapes are grown where. So I think that areas that have the flexibility of mind to change grape varieties, in my personal opinion, this is complete personal opinion, those are the ones that I think will dominate. So let me just check. We've got a couple more minutes left. Oh, this is an interesting question. I don't know who it was from, so I apologize. Do UV levels have anything to do with what we see here? I have been doing some research onto UV levels because obviously there's a big discussion in New Zealand around UV in particular, where there's a hole in the ozone layer. The evidence is currently suggesting that it's not actually a big cause of some of these issues. Oh, Mahesh says it was Roger, so thank you, Roger. So the evidence is currently suggesting no, and one of the reasons it's suggesting no is our ozone layer is actually one of the only things that we seem to have done well in the last 15 to 20 years. We're patching up the ozone layer, so the UV levels are actually reducing. Well, sorry, they're not reducing, but they're not increasing. So the problems are increasing, but our UV levels aren't. What is interesting is some of the discussions around which esters and pyrazines and things like that are more prevalent, I suppose, in certain UV areas. So there is an argument or a school of thought that the kind of more gooseberry, tropical, grapefruit, classic Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc, is down to the high levels of UV. Now, there are other people that say it's the yeast that they're using, blah, blah, blah. But there is an argument that certain levels of UV actually change the taste of wine. So one thing that is interesting to consider is whether, more research gets done into that, because if we do have UV levels changing, will that change the nature of the wine as well as things like the temperature? So yes, we are, I suppose you could say we are seeing changes, but we're just not really sure whether to attribute them to UV levels. But it's very interesting, should we say. Somebody's also made a comment that helicopters don't help the CO2 levels. I can't agree more. Helicopters and CO2 and climate change are bad news. Unfortunately, so are candles, and I will be really honest with you. Those candles are not good for the environment, neither are the fans. So we must consider alternatives, and we must consider preservation rather than reaction methods, because we don't currently have a system or a reactive solution for frost that is not damaging to the environment. So we're really we're fighting a global phenomenon problem with something that is not going to help the solution. Right, that's 8 o'clock. I will, there's so much to send you. Just a final note, somebody up north, and I think by the surname I suspect probably in Scotland, says that my light has disappeared here in Essex, but up north they still have daylight. So I hope you're enjoying that daylight. But yes, the light here has disappeared. So it's time for many of you, I think, to go and have your dinner. But what I would say is there is so much information on this that we have, and I'm about to use a turn of phrase that's not appropriate for a climate change talk, but we have touched the tip of the iceberg tonight. I've given you a few examples from around the world about stuff that's going on, but it is a vast subject area. Going to do my best tomorrow to send you some links to research that I've been reading, also to incredible forums, and I would say that probably my favorite at the moment is the Porto Protocol, so run by Adrian Bridge of Taylor's and his team, which is an incredible movement to try and get winemakers together to discuss climate change and viticulture. But they do some really interesting podcasts with many of our producers. I mean, they've got Frog Sleep, they've got all sorts of people on. I think they've had Jason Howes on a couple of times. So there are some really interesting things if you like to listen to podcasts, but the reading material out there at the moment is hard to devour, but it is incredible. And some people make it very easy to absorb, even if it's not the lightest subject matter or the lightest reading. So I hope that you've enjoyed it. I hope that maybe you've considered not only your wine choices, because at the end of the day, as I mentioned at the beginning, we are keeping people in a living by drinking our wine, and we're also, yes, we're adding to climate change, so we need to consider more sensible choices, and we need to be aware of it, but it is important that we look at the big picture, and we need to make some huge lifestyle changes, all of us. I'm sure I'm not preaching here, but I think we all do, and we all know that. So I do hope that once you've consumed your lovely bottles of wine this evening, you do take them to be recycled. And if you happen to be anywhere near the Ventoux, you don't even need to. You can go and take them to be washed and then redistributed to the local wineries. So lovely evening, one and all. Thank you very much for joining. Thank you to Mahesh from behind the scenes. I will be linking to everything that I've mentioned, or as best as I can within reason. And I'm going to enjoy my Pinot Noir from the UK. And cheers to you all.